Ever since humans roamed the earth, they have always tried to make new weapons to live longer and make their lives easier. And the more you move forward towards history, the better these tools get. We keep moving forward until we get to the First World War and Second World War. Even though most weapons are modernized at this point, but people were still trying to figure out new ways to win the battle. They were always trying to figure out a way to create a weapon that their enemy didn't have. Even something simple. In the Second World War, a general named John O'Daniel was fighting the Italians, and the Italians would attack the Americans by using torpedoes. When the general was confronted with the shells of these torpedoes, an idea popped in his head, and he told his men to cut these shells in half because I need to do something with them. After he sees what it is, he orders 10 more of these torpedoes to be made, and he also tells his men to use metal pipes to connect each other and add a tow attachment to it. When you look at this, you see a bunch of caskets behind the tank and it's being pulled through a field. These half torpedoes were made in a way where a soldier could lay in there with all their weapons, ready to have a fight. 12 soldiers with a lot of weapons are moving towards the battlefield, and the enemy has no idea that these men are back there. It seems like the tank is pulling a farm equipment behind it. It's interesting to know that on the Eastern Front, the Russians were using something similar, but for the snow. Before this, the soldiers were supposed to run and walk behind the tank with all that equipment, and it was a high chance of getting hit in these fields. With the help of this invention, the soldiers could rest in these little casket-looking things and be ready to have a fight. The soldier up front had a cable in his hands, and if things got sketchy or if they wanted to release from the tank, he would just pull the cable and it would stop. After General O'Daniels figured this invention out, 360 of these were made, and it was used in different battles. They used this invention for a few years, and eventually it was put away. And the main reason it wasn't used anymore was because it couldn't pass by any obstacle. It would get stuck if there was a lot of obstacles in the way. Let's go to the 1950s. The US Navy is looking for a control tower where it can see what is happening in the battlefield, kind of like a scissor lift. This is the concept that the US Navy made back then. There's a massive fan underneath the soldier, and he can sit on the platform and fly it up and down. The US Navy liked this design, and that is why they ordered the same concept vehicle to Hiller Aircraft Design. In the 1954, Hiller comes out with the VZ-1 Pawnee. You could say this is one of the first helicopters. At this point, helicopters were being made, but they weren't actually being used because they were considered a concept vehicle. The way Hiller Company designed this aircraft is very interesting. Whichever direction you pushed your foot, it would turn to that direction. If you push right, it goes right. If you push both of them, you go forward and vice versa. It was an interesting design and was properly made, but the US Navy realized that it's too dangerous for having something like this in the battlefield, and that is why they scrapped the idea. For the third invention, let's go to the Cold War, when the Soviet Union and the United States are looking for new tools so they can win this cold battle. Ever since the Cold War began, the Americans were always looking for an aircraft that could go up and down vertically without actually landing like an airplane. The company called Convair designs this concept for an aircraft carrier. It was called the XFY Pogo, and it looked something very sketchy. This is an odd looking airplane that lands vertically, and it seems like it's a half helicopter, half missile, half airplane. When they designed the XFY-1 Pogo, they told a bunch of aircraft pilots to test this thing out, and a lot of them declined, and they said they prefer not to. Nobody was willing to test this thing out for the very first time, and after 4 months, eventually a pilot had the guts to actually test it. A pilot named James F. Coleman. The interior of the aircraft is very similar to a fighter jet, but it just lifts vertically, and instead of seeing in front of you, you're looking at the sky. The first test consisted of going up and down to make sure it's stable, and then it's brought back down, which is the hardest part. But a month later, they were gonna test it the vertical phase, and it was being done by the same pilot. James Coleman successfully flies this thing and goes full vertical with it, and he actually landed it perfectly the first time. Convair designs this same aircraft with a jet engine as well. They test this and it was very successful as well. But there was one huge problem, and that was a pilot. Because not just any pilot could fly this thing, and landing it and getting up is the hardest part because you can't look in front of you. Let's go look at the British and see what kind of inventions they came up with. The British Navy was the strongest navy for a couple of centuries, and their specialty was they would get near a port to an empire they wanted to take over and start blasting with cannons. Most of their invention was in this department as well. You're probably familiar with D-Day, where they wanted to take over Normandy from the sea, and that is why this double wheel was made. This thing was called the Great Panjandrum, and it had a lot of explosions inside it. It was gonna propel itself with the help of a bunch of tiny rockets, and it would start spinning towards its target. Just like the good old days, the British were gonna launch this thing from the sea, and with the rockets it would fly through the water and enter the beach and hit the enemy and explode. They very quickly realized that this is a terrible idea because the tiny rockets that would propel it would misfire and it would go a wrong direction, causing it to fall over. So this would do more damage than good in a Normandy takeover. In World War II, the British were always looking for cheap weapons that would do a lot of destruction, like destroying German dams, bringing a ship down with something cheap. In World War II, when they wanted to attack submarines or ships, they would shoot torpedoes. But in World War II, there was a lot of torpedo nuts everywhere that would stop these things from hitting anything. So it wasn't as effective as before. That is the reason the British were looking for a weapon that would fly over the water rather than inside it, so nothing would stop it. It's kind of like when you skip a rock on an empty river, this thing jumps over, skips, and then it hits something. This is the exact idea the British used for this weapon. The name of the project was also called the Bouncing Bomb. This weapon was made and it was considered a great idea. The bomb was basically in a form of a barrel filled with explosive. The airplane would fly extremely low on top of the water and release. The British were able to destroy more than 10 German dams with the help of this little barrel. It was also extremely dangerous as well, because the airplane had to fly extremely low to the ground before releasing the bomb. And sometimes when the bomb would hit the water for the first time, it would bounce up and actually crash into the airplane itself. All these designs we showed you in the video have all been discontinued or scrapped. But the real question is, maybe the simplest idea in a battle could be the most useful. What do you guys think? You've most likely heard about the B-2 stealth bomber. And you might have seen our video about the HO-229. But all these planes are in the past because a new kid is in town. The B-21 Raider. Just like its father, this thing is also a stealth bomber. The same company that built a B-2 bomber, meaning Northrop Grumman, built the B-21. This thing flies at about 50,000 feet, and that's about 15,240 meters. This height is exactly the same as the B-2, but experts believe that the B-21 can fly way higher, and it could go as high as 70,000 feet. Even though B-21 is newer, it's smaller and it carries less weight. It can carry about 13.5 tons worth of bombs. But the B-2 can carry up to 20 tons. At first, Northrop Grumman wanted to make this a drone, and that means it wouldn't have a pilot. But when they realized that this thing is going to be carrying an atomic bomb, they decided not to go with the drone idea. And someone should be on board if they decide to drop an atomic bomb. The B-2 has a special paint that's black, and it makes it stealthy, but the B-21 is painted white. They didn't say the reason they chose white paint, but it's for sure more stealthy than the B-2. And you could find similar technology on the F-22 and F-35. The B-2 is not completely digital, and it has analog parts, but the B-21 is completely digital, and this allows the engineers to always have this thing upgraded when they need it to, and you could treat it like a computer update rather than a part upgrade. When they revealed the B-21, they never showed the rear of it, and they never said how many engines it has. The front is obvious, it has 2 air ducts, but you can't see the rear, and you don't know if it has 4 jet engines or 2 jet engines, or maybe something exotic, and obviously everything is classified. Since this aircraft is so classified, why did they even reveal it in the first place? The main reason is the deal that the United States has with Russia, and that deal says if you built a new bomber and want to actually use it around the world, you have to reveal it to the world. So that is the exact reason the B-21 was revealed. It's good to know that the B-2 stealth bomber is extremely expensive, and it costs about $2 billion each. So how much is the B-21? It's a little bit cheaper, and one of the main reasons is that it's smaller. It carries less weight, but one of the main reasons it's cheaper is because of the technology and the research and development that Northrop Grumman has. Each of these B-21 Raiders will cost about $692 million. So you could say it's pretty cheap compared to the B-2. It's about 1/3 of the price. The US Air Force has ordered 100 of these B-21, but no other information came out that when the plane will be exactly ready and when it's gonna take its first flight. In the year 2009, when Obama was president, the government was starting to worry about the bomber fleets they had in stock, and they believed that they didn't have any modern bombers. At that time, the B-52 was over 50 years old, and the B-1 bomber was more than 35 years old, and the B-2 was about 20 years old, and that is why they needed a new bomber. In the year 1989, when they revealed the B-2 stealth bomber, the US military ordered 132 of them, and the plan was to replace the B-52 and the B-1 bomber, but the B-2 turned out to be so expensive and the cost of flight is so high that after 21 of these were turned into the US military, they decided to cancel the rest of them. And that means 111 of these were canceled. And also, the B-52 and the B-1 are still flying. And that's exactly why they needed a new B-2 bomber. They needed something more modern, a little cheaper, and something that allows them to retire the older ones. Just like we said, at first they wanted to make it a drone, but since it was carrying a nuclear weapon, they couldn't do that. In the year 2012, Obama signed a bill that gives a budget of $3.7 billion to build a new bomber. At that time, a lot of people complained that why are you wasting so much money? We don't need another military aircraft. We have the F-22, the F-35 is coming along. B-2, B-1, B-52, they're all flying. They have no problems. And you want to pay more for another one? But at that time, China revealed their new bomber. And after they revealed their new stealth bomber, a lot of these people kept their mouth shut after that. After the budget was signed, just like every time, they contacted 3 different companies and they told them what kind of an order they have in mind. And the order was a very modern aircraft that could replace the old ones. Boeing, Northrop Grumman, and Lockheed Martin were chosen. To do this, Boeing and Lockheed Martin partnered up to create a new bomber. But Northrop Grumman decided to go solo. This is the design that Boeing and Lockheed Martin came up, and it looks like a fighter jet craft rather than a traditional bomber we're used to. After Northrop Grumman built the B-2 bomber, they started to design a passenger aircraft that resembles the B-2 bomber, and the nickname was the Northrop Grumman 2025. The company was working on this project for a long time, but they never were ready to execute it. We already know that the government chose Northrop Grumman, and they built the B-21 Raider. But what made Northrop Grumman be chosen between the other two is that they had a lot of research in this style of an aircraft. So they were very much ready to build another much more modern one. And also another reason Northrop Grumman was chosen was that the US government was kind of angry at the company Boeing, and the reason was that they had sold some tankers that had issues and they haven't figured out what the problem is. So Northrop Grumman was chosen, and they built something spectacular because they actually built something that's affordable for the US government. It's completely stealth, and because it's digital, you can upgrade it throughout the years. The B-21 was revealed, but it's not ready to use yet, and the plan is by the year 2026 or 2027, the B-21 enters service. So right now, we don't have a complete video of this thing actually flying around. First of all, they didn't even show the rear of it, and there is no footage of it flying yet. But experts believe that the era of bombers and fighter jets are over, and drones are taking it all. What do you guys think? When we look at the history of Germany in World War II, it's very surprising because in such a short period of time, they achieved a lot. Most of these findings was from doing evil activities like Joseph Mengele, but their industry was actually very advanced. Today, we want to look at one of these technologies, the Horten Ho 229, an insane idea of an aircraft. The radar could not detect it whatsoever. It was the fastest plane at its time, and it could go to the other side of the pond without refueling. The Germans were really trying their hardest to finish this early, and that's for only one thing: to attack New York City. The official name of this airplane was the Ho 229, but the nickname was the American Bomber, and what they meant was that this bomber is designed specifically for the United States. A plane like this was originally designed in the early 1930s, way before World War II was even an idea. Even though there was no war yet, but Hitler knew that the United States was one of the main enemies, and that is why they were always looking for tools to attack the Americans, and he always believed that they have to attack the US. In 1937, the Germans designed a plane called the Me-264, and they believed it could easily fly to the United States. In the year 1938, the commander of the Nazi Air Force by the name of Hermann Göring said, "We are designing weapons that could get to the other side of the pond, and that means the other side of the Atlantic Ocean." What he was trying to do was threat the US, but he never used the US name. This is in a way where World War II has not begun yet. Year after year passes and World War II has started, but Me-264, even though it could fly to the United States, but it couldn't carry anything with it, so it had to fly alone, and at that point, there was no reason to send it there. We get to the year 1944. The Russians are moving forward towards Germany, but the Germans believe, even if the war is at a loss, we need to attack New York with this aircraft. The Nazi Air Force told its workers that we need an aircraft that could go 11,000 kilometers and it could carry 4,000 kilograms worth of bombs. They needed 11,000 kilometers so it would fly from Berlin all the way to America and back without refueling. But aircraft engineers in Germany would say, a design like this is impossible. There has to be a stop for refueling. And they would choose the Azores Island in the middle of the Atlantic. And they said, if they can refuel in this island, it's possible. In the middle of all this, there were two brothers that considered themselves aircraft engineers, and they're called the Horten brothers. They had a design that was meant for a bomber exactly like this, and with all their calculations, this bomber can do whatever the army needs. Just like we said, these two designed this aircraft from the 1930s, and at that time, it seemed unbelievable that such thing could be built because there was a plan to put 6 jet engines on there, and at this time, the most advanced planes had impellers. This design of an aircraft is called a flying wing, and what it means is that the entire aircraft is a wing and there's no actual body or tube. And because of this design, the Horten brothers believe that this plane will use 30% less fuel than an ordinary plane. And they believe the most important thing about this plane is that it will not be seen on the radars. And that's mostly because of the design. It's good to know that what the Horten brothers said about radars was one of the first times they mentioned this, because before then, there was no anti-radar aircraft. This was one of the final designs the Horten brothers drew. They first named it the Horten 18. The width was about 40 meters and the length was about 19 meters. And if you count the whole plane, it's about 150 square meters. Look at this plane. It doesn't seem like it belongs to the 40s. If someone saw this thing back in the day, they'll probably think it's a UFO. Even if you see this fly over your head, it's extremely insane. Imagine you saw it in 1944. The normal speed of the Ho 229 was about 750 kilometers an hour, but it had a top speed of 900 kilometers an hour, and that made it the fastest aircraft at that time. They never actually got to use this plane like that, but when the Horten brothers were building this plane, they said it could easily go to New York, bomb, and come back. There were 2 guns up front on this plane, and it also had a rear gun, and anyone that wanted to attack this plane, it had weapons to counterattack. Technology really leads to a design that doesn't make sense, and it's insane. And you might not believe it, the chassis of this aircraft was made from wood, and that was another reason why you could not see it on the radar. On February of 1945, this plane was pretty much finished and they wanted to test it. There's only 2 months left until the war is over, but the Germans would not let this project go whatsoever, even though they were losing almost every battle on the Eastern Western Front. This plane was about to get done and they still haven't tested yet. The Horten brothers were very good designers, but I wouldn't call them master engineers, and that is why aircraft engineers will always critique their work and always tell them that your design will never actually work in the real world. The engineers would say that if you want this thing to actually fly, you need to add a wing like this to it. The brothers would disagree and tell them that this brings the weight up and you can't do it anymore. But the brothers still went at it and tried to fix the issues. They said, we're gonna make the engines from 6 to 2 engine and make it a little bit smaller. They took the same aircraft and modified it and made it 2 jet engine. They say they tested this aircraft, but it was too late because the Allies were inside Berlin and the Germans decided to scrap the plane so nobody gets it. There are pictures of this aircraft flying, but we're not sure if it's real or not. It's good to know that the Horten brothers successfully changed this aircraft in under 2 months. They tested it, but they never used it. Because in April 1945, Berlin had fallen, and that's 2 months after they started to redesign the aircraft. All the designs and writings of this aircraft were in the Americans' hands now, and the US even has a piece of this aircraft. And they realized that the Germans had actually built 3 of these aircrafts, and 1 of these were destroyed. They don't know what happened with the other one, but 1 of them was in pieces and the Americans had it. And right now this piece is in a museum in Washington, D.C., and you could go and see it. When the Americans reviewed the design of this aircraft, they wouldn't believe it. These 2 brothers were considered geniuses at that time. There could have been fear in their eyes because they believed that if they did not defeat the Germans, this thing would attack New York. It's good to know that the Horten brothers designed the same style aircraft for a passenger one, but obviously something like this would never work because it would be too complicated and expensive. So what happened to these Horten brothers? One of them, called Raymar Horten, ran away to Argentina and they don't know much about him. But one of the brothers by the name of Walter Horten stayed in Germany and he basically started helping the West. This style of an aircraft came alive in the 1970s when the Americans were trying to design a bomber with the same design. The US started in 1970s and by the year 1989 they had done it and they built the B-2 stealth bomber, and this is one of the most expensive aircrafts in history. Walter Horten was alive until 1998 and he lived in West Germany. Even though he was part of the Nazi regime, he helped the Westerners and that is why they pardoned him, and he eventually died in Germany. Even though the Nazis were not in power for a long time, but they brought a lot of technology in this world, and one of the most insane things they figured out was rocket and missile technology. A lot of people believe that if the US did not capture Nazi scientists, they could have not gone to the moon. But let's be honest, it would have taken a long time to figure out how rockets work. Forget about satellites and moon landing. In terms of medicine, the Nazis did a lot of experiments. As you know, the Axis powers were the Germans and the Japanese mainly, and they did a lot of experiments in terms of medicine at that time, but in extremely horrifying types of tests. If you've seen our video about Japan's Unit 731 or Joseph Mengele, Angel of Death, you should really check them out and see what type of experiments these people were running. We have seen plenty of weird aircrafts in our lifetimes. One of those airplanes is this, the Fairchild Republic A-10 Thunderbolt II, or the nickname Warthog, or just Hog. Even though a lot of people don't know this aircraft, but it's one of the most important airplanes in US history. In the 1970s, during the peak of the Cold War, the Americans were afraid of West Germany, and they felt like the Russians will attack from East Germany. The most important strategic position in this area was around Frankfurt, in a place called the Fulda Gap. If a war broke loose, it was very strategic to have this location in your hands. And that is why the Americans wanted to get ready before anything happened, and they wanted to have their tools and equipment in order. They knew if the Russians decided to attack from East Germany towards West Germany, they're gonna do it with the help of tanks. That is why they wanted an aircraft that was anti-tank. In a very short period of time, they built the A-10 Warthog, an aircraft that flies extremely low and surprise attacks different types of vehicles, especially tanks. You might say, what type of aircraft is this? Is this a fighter? Is it a bomber? It is none of that. This is under the close air support class. When we say close air support, we really mean it, because this thing flies extremely close to the battlefield, and that is why it takes a lot of damage when it enters. Usually, they can't really hit an aircraft like this with rockets and tanks because they don't have enough time to line up a shot, but they will get blasted with soldiers and different weapon systems. So like we're saying, this aircraft has nothing to do with any other aircraft you're familiar to. It's a close air support. So when they decide to send this thing to the battlefield, it has to be like a Toyota Camry. You just start it up and go to the battlefield. It doesn't need a lot of testing and getting ready before it enters. You could compare the A-10 to like a Jeep Willys in World War II. Anytime it enters a battlefield, it will get blasted with bullets. But the most important part is that it will return even with all this damage taken. But if anything like this were to happen to any other aircraft in the military, they would not return. They will be destroyed on the spot. And that means the A-10 has to be a very simple yet a high performance aircraft. Do you know how this aircraft was built? Long story short, when the Americans ordered it from Fairchild Republic, they took different parts from their shelves and put this thing together. And it's unlike any other aircraft like the F-22 or SR-71, where billions of dollars had to go into research. The Pentagon didn't really mind how the airplane was going to be built. The most important part about the craft was that it had to have a ginormous gun, and the gun is this, the General Electric GAU-8 Avenger. This is no normal machine gun. It has a length of 6 meters, and the barrel is so long that it passes underneath the pilot's foot. I mean, just look at it next to a Volkswagen Beetle. The big barrel you see at the end of the gun is actually the magazine of the gun, and it could hold 1,150 rounds, and those are no normal rounds, 30mm rounds. What you're hearing is 3,900 rounds per minute being fired, but obviously they can't just shoot it for a minute straight, because the barrel would be fried, and that is why you only hear it in short bursts, and they don't want it to overheat. So now we realize that this machine gun is the most important part of this aircraft, and it's so heavy and ginormous that it needs 2 hydraulic pumps to work it. But why did they add 2 of them? Because if one of them decides to stop working, the other one comes online and helps out. And just like we said, the gun is the most important part of the aircraft, and without it, this thing is useless. The hydraulic system also moves the wing's flaps up and down as well, but the most amount of power that's needed from the hydraulic pump is to move this giant gun. The A-10 is so simply made that if both of the hydraulic pumps decided to stop working, only the gun would stop working, because the pilot is still able to maneuver the aircraft without the flaps working and have a safe landing. Another awesome engineering fact about the A-10 is the landing gear, because it's designed in a way where it doesn't actually hide and it's always exposed even when it's retracted. They purposefully designed it like this, so if anything were to happen, the aircraft can still land. And that is why this aircraft is known as simple but high performance. Of course, the safest part about this aircraft is the cabin. In simple terms, it's a box of titanium and nothing will pass through it. Some may ask, why did they make it out of steel to make it cheaper? That would make the aircraft too heavy. There are 16 flares attached to the A-10. That's a safety feature, and that means if any missile or anything that wants to follow it, the flares could help the A-10 escape. Why is the two jet engines located like this on the A-10? One of the reasons is that if a missile or a rocket were to follow this aircraft, it could lose it much easier because of the way the heat releases. The rear wings of this aircraft is a very similar design to a World War II aircraft. And the main reason is that when this massive gun is shooting and it creates a lot of recoil, the rear wings allows the aircraft to stay stable and not rise up the nose. Without these rear wings, this thing cannot shoot straight. And another reason the engines are located on top, it could land in dirt runways. This massive machine guns that's unbelievable has unbelievable bullets as well. The bullet itself is made from uranium. Not the shell, but the round itself. But why uranium? Uranium is an extremely dense metal. Like for example, tungsten has really high density, but when it hits something, it flattens out and stops puncturing. But a uranium round will cut through and continue cutting through. And just like we said, the A-10 is an anti-tank aircraft, so it needs to puncture tanks. Do these uranium shells pollute the area? Well, yes it does, because it's uranium. A lot of these rounds were used, especially in Afghanistan and the Iraq War. And a lot of people say these rounds are the reason a lot of people have cancer in these areas. So a lot of people are blaming the rounds they used in the A-10s. It has been years since the US government is trying to retire this aircraft, because without these rounds, the A-10 is not that useful. But to this day, the US Air Force has not decided to retire this thing, and it continues to use it to this day. Americans believe that the F-35 is like Muhammad Ali. It fires from afar and it doesn't allow you to hit it. But the A-10 will attack head first and return home nearly destroyed. The A-10 could be compared to a cheap motorcycle where it's reliable and easy to maintain. When the A-10 was ready in the year 1977, each airplane cost around $1.4 million. And it's good to know that around the same time, the F-14 was made. But each F-14 costs about $38 million. But the F-14 is a whole different story. It's the most successful fighter in the world, and we've made a video about it.